Hello everyone, thank you for being here today, and thank you for my co-hosts for helping preparing this event, and for the kind introduction. My name is Leah Pearcrest, and I am the Deputy Director of Human Rights Without Frontiers. It is a Brussels-based NGO that has been working on freedom of religion or belief around the world. Over the past few years, we have been working closely with religious communities in China, including Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghur Muslims, Christians from house churches, Buddhists, and the Church of Almighty God. So members from all of these communities have sought asylum abroad in North America, Europe, South Korea, and elsewhere because of their religious persecution in China. Human Rights Without Frontiers has worked to collect testimonies, affidavits, legal documents, data, and information from many people who have suffered this religious persecution. From our research, we know that the fears of these people do not end once they escape China. In many countries, members of Chinese religious communities are faced with authorities who do not comprehend the danger that lies within China for these people. From our research, we have seen individuals be sent back to China by ill-informed judges and courts in various countries. Such court decisions directly violate international laws related to non-refoulement because these individuals do face high risk of being tortured in China. For those who may not know, non-refoulement is a fundamental principle of international law that forbids countries from returning asylum seekers to their country of origin. The United Nations 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol defines the principle of non-refoulement as the cornerstone of international refugee protection. It defines non-refoulement as the principle that no contracting state shall expel or return a refugee in any manner whatsoever to the frontiers of territories where his or her life or freedom would be threatened on the account of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. The European Union Fundamental Rights Agency accurately describes that if a person is at risk of facing torture in their country of origin, laws of non-refoulement apply. I will not read the whole quote, but please do, and also see it in your brochures. So it is important to note that China has ratified the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, known as the CAT, and holds various provisions in national laws to protect individuals from various types of torture. However, it is apparent that China has yet to meet these international standards. In particular, religious minorities in China are at high risk of being subject to arrest and torture if they remain in China, or if they are extradited back to China. To understand the severity of these risks, I'd like to share a few stories. One of which I heard at a conference just last week is the story of a young Uyghur woman named Marigold Tursun. Marigold Tursun is not yet 30 years old and has faced unimaginable torture at the hands of Chinese authorities in East Turkestan. Since 2015, Ms. Tursun was arrested 3 times, each time being separated from her 3 infant children. The first time she was arrested in the airport upon her return from Egypt, she was taken by authorities and separated from her children, who were only 45 days old. While in detention camps, Ms. Tursun was brutally beaten. She was starved, electrocuted, and strip-searched by Chinese police. While in detention, Ms. Tursun was tortured in an electric chair, forced to take unidentified drugs, and was forced to sing songs which praised the Communist Party. She was held in crowded, unsanitary prison cells and reported that there were 9 women who died in her cell while she was there. Thankfully, Ms. Durson now resides in the United States with 2 of her children. Her 3rd child died while she was being detained, and to this day she does not know the cause of her child's death. Ms. Durson's story is only one of the many we are now hearing from Uyghurs who survived the camps in East Turkestan. It has been predicted that up to 3 million are imprisoned in these so-called re-education camps. Scholars reporting last week in Washington, D.C. now believe that there are 8 different kinds of camps that Uyghurs are held in, including prison camps, labor camps, and re-education day camps. As more stories from these camps are now being recognized in the media, the trends are apparent. All of the Uyghurs I have met and interviewed personally have faced torture and inhumane treatment and living conditions while imprisoned by the Chinese authorities. With high numbers of scholars looking into the building of the camps, and with refugees sharing their stories, it has become impossible to deny the reality in East Turkestan. And unfortunately, this torture reality does not end with the Uyghurs. Falun Gong practitioners have also been heavily persecuted since 1999 and have also reported high rates of torture after being arrested and imprisoned by Chinese authorities. Recent stories of 2 Falun Gong practitioners particularly stand out in my mind and highlight the continued severity of torture that is going on as we sit here today. Mr. Pan Liang, who is 44 years old, worked as an armed police officer until he was arrested for practicing Falun Gong. He is currently serving his 3rd prison sentence. Mr. Pang was first arrested and given a 3-year prison sentence in a labor camp in 2002. During this initial imprisonment, guards used electric batons and beat him severely. Mr. Pang was left permanently disabled after this first imprisonment. During this first time, he was also tied to a chair and forced to listen to propaganda against Falun Gong through headphones nonstop for an entire week. During this week, he was deprived of sleep and was not allowed to use the toilets. When his wife heard the news of his torture, she reported the case. And this only made matters worse. The guards increased their cruelty. Mr. Pang was released from prison in 2006, only to be arrested again in 2009 and sentenced again to 3 more years in prison. He was released in 2012 and then arrested again in 2013. After this final arrest in 2013, he was not even given a prison sentence. The only news of Mr. Pang surfaced in late 2018 when a group of Falun Gong practitioners were released from the Xinyi prison and they told stories of Mr. Pang's severe torture. He refused to renounce his faith and to this day is still being tortured. Even more recently, just last month, on the night of May 12, 2019, Ms. Hong Shizhen was ambushed and beaten while she was hanging banners that promoted Falun Gong. As the assailant beat her, several police cars arrived. Instead of questioning or arresting her attacker, the police took Ms. Hong to the town police station. The following day, the police attempted to admit her to a detention center. However, she was in a bad health condition and she did not pass the health exam. This left the police with no option but to release her. Ms. Hong, who is 55 years old, used to be very ill and bedridden, but with her faith and her community around her, Ms. Hong was able to fully recover. The story of Ms. Hong goes to show that Chinese authorities do not only mistreat those who are formally sentenced and who are in prison currently, but with any religious person who they come in contact with. In addition to these groups, since 1991, the Church of Almighty God has faced the brutality of torture at the hands of Chinese authorities, which over the past few years has caught the attention of international institutions, NGOs, and scholars. In 2018, Human Rights Without Frontiers collected the testimonies of over 30 Church of Almighty God members who were former prisoners and stories from their family members. We published many of these cases in the report called Tortured to Death, which you can also find in the hallway. Please take a copy. These are only a small fraction of Church of Almighty God members who are in prison. Human Rights Without Frontiers has documented over 2,000 prisoners, and that's not even a complete number. So one testimony that we received regarded Quan Ko, a Church of Almighty God member who in October 2014 recognized that he could no longer safely remain in China and fled to South Korea for asylum. On March 24th, 2015, his asylum application in South Korea was denied. Quan Ko appealed to the authorities and attempted to explain that if he was deported to China, he would be arrested. Despite these efforts, his appeal was rejected by the South Korean government on June 30th, 2016. He did remain in South Korea despite his asylum rejection letter. He was unable to legally work and was not eligible for any government benefits, and he suffered from a heart disease. Without any other options, he returned to Hubei province in China to receive medical attention on March 11, 2017. Fearing capture if he returned to his home, he checked into a hotel. On 13th May, around 8 a.m., while he was at the front desk of his hotel, the captain of the Hubei Province National Security Brigade, Mr. Feng, along with 5 other plainclothed police officers, stopped him and searched his bags. Although they did not find anything suspicious in his luggage, the police officers handcuffed him and transported him to an unidentified location in Jingmen. The police officers brought him to a room and handcuffed him to a chair. He was violently interrogated by police over the next 2 months until his release on the 21st of July, 2017. Despite his physical release from imprisonment, he remained under constant surveillance by the authorities and is required to regularly report to the police where he faces interrogations frequently. More recently than this case, Ren Kuifang, who joined the Church of Almighty God in 2011, was arrested on December 22, 2018. On January 3, 2019, just 12 days later, her family was told that she had died. The authorities took her family to the morgue, where they saw her body that was covered in bruises, lacerations, and burn marks. The authorities denied that she was tortured while in custody. Her family attempted to launch an investigation into her death and sought legal channels to hold accountable those responsible for her death, but this did not work. Her family reports that the CCP offered them money in return for being silent about her death. As we know, the Chinese authorities have targeted religious individuals and communities across the country. Individuals are often arrested for their religious beliefs, and as we are finding, torture is a high trend amongst religious prisoners. Human Rights Without Frontiers has maintained a global freedom of religion or belief prisoners database over the past few years. China vastly exceeds all other countries in the number of freedom of religion or belief prisoners currently being held. Human Rights Without Frontiers has thus far collected thousands of individual cases within China, and we know that this is not a complete list. The list does not contain many who have disappeared and does not include the estimated millions of Uyghurs who are currently being detained in extrajudicial camps. A high number of religious prisoners reflect China's abysmal records regarding torture. The United States State Department country reports on human rights practices raise many issues related to torture in China. The report logs the following widespread concerns in China. Individuals being detained by authorities and being held at undisclosed locations or disappearances, individuals being beaten, subjected to electric shock, forced to sit on stools for hours, being hung by their wrists, being raped, sleep-deprived, force-fed, and other forms of physical and psychological abuse, harsh and degrading conditions in penal institutions, arbitrary arrests and detention, the denial of fair public trials, and violations in freedom of privacy. This report is careful to note that although ordinary prisoners were abused, prison authorities reportedly singled out political and religious dissidents for particularly harsh treatment. The high rates of freedom of religion or belief prisoners, paired with these high rates of torture across the country, paint a grim picture. Human Rights Without Frontiers adds to this State Department list specific methods that we believe are frequently used against religious prisoners. These include constant surveillance, the illegal entrance of homes without any search warrant, disappearances, attempts to forcefully extract a statement of renouncing one's faith, the forced administration of drugs, violent interrogations and severe beatings, sleep deprivation, the use of torture racks in which individuals are forced to sit on sharp surfaces, programs of extreme psychological pressure, and an overall lack of internal investigations regarding allegations of torture. With such treatment in China, members of religious communities are seeking refuge in other countries. And again, to repeat that original statement from the European Union's fundamental rights agencies, all persons, regardless of their legal status, the principle of non-refoulement is a core component of the prohibition of torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, which is enshrined in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights and the United Nations Convention Against Torture. The testimonies that have been given, and the ones that are about to be given later today, are proof of the reality in China. Such testimonies are also in agreement with the research of NGOs, academics, and international institutions. In conclusion, the research is clear and the legal expectations are clear. States need to abide by the international non-refoulement laws and cease the extradition of Chinese asylum seekers from religious minority groups, as they are at grave risk of torture and inhumane treatment should they re-enter China. Thank you.